Hello guys, welcome to another video, and in this one I want to do a bit of discussion on a new build that I've been playing, which is a Chieftain Incinerate of Venting build. And I want to discuss this one because this has so many cool interactions going on, and to be honest with you, at this stage of the build, I'm not really sure whether I'm cooking or whether this is just completely cooked. I guess you guys can decide on that one. But there are a lot of really cool interactions going on with this build. I'm using a lot of interesting different tech here. So let's just get straight into it. So let me just begin with how I actually landed on this build idea, how the concept kind of came together. And this all began with Enmity's Embrace, which is a ring, very, very powerful ring that's being used a lot at the moment. Of course, it gets used on mercs all the time, but this is also very good on other characters, especially Chieftain, because you can kind of build around fire resistance. This one imposes a really heavy resistance penalty on you, 65% reduced resistance. That's actually the best roll you can get without a volatile Valor Orb. And that one will actually lower your fire resistance by quite a lot. And then you need to kind of overcome the downside to be able to get the benefit of using this ring, which is the damage penetration there, the fire resistance penetration, which is damage penetrates fire resistance equal to your overcapped fire resistance up to a maximum of 200%. So you need a lot of fire resistance to actually make use of this ring. Now usually what people have been doing with this ring is combining it with the Foulborn Skin of the Lord or Skin of the Loyal, in which case you actually get a modifier on there which says increased elemental and chaos resistances, and that modifier is additive with this one, so you can basically reduce this downside to almost nothing, and then you can just stack fire resistance a lot easier, and you're able to reach that 200% overcap a lot easier. The problem is, I like playing hardcore, so I'm currently playing, in hardcore trade, and in hardcore, giving up your body armor slot for basically no defenses is not really a thing. It's very, very difficult to get away with. And so I'm looking at a different option in this build, that is the Replica Veil of the Night, which says 22% increase elemental resistances. Again, that's an additive modifier with Enmity's Embrace, and that's going to lower that downside by quite a lot. But this helmet is a bit of a meme, or it's at least considered to be a bit of a meme. The normal version, of course, sets your elemental resistances to 0. This one sets your defenses to 0. So that means my armor, my evasion, and my energy shield, and my ward, if I had any ward, all of that is 0. So I can't gain any benefits from any defenses at all. You can see right there, my energy shield is 0. And, any armor I'm gaining from any of these pieces, you can see I don't have quality on any of these because it doesn't really matter. From the body armor, I'm actually getting a different stat there. But just generally speaking, any kind of quality scaling on defensive stats there doesn't really matter because I'm getting 0 from all of that. However, this does enable me to fix my resistances. You can see here I currently have 294% fire resistance, so I'm just over that cap of 200%. I'm currently 204% over the cap, which means I'm gaining the full 200% fire penetration from this ring. Now, the idea of this build kind of came together with using the Will of Xoph rings, and then gaining a bunch of aura effect for Purity of Fire, because that means you get tons and tons of fire resistance. We're not talking about just the maximum fire resistance, I'm talking about just the standard fire resistance here. This is a level 23 gem right here, that's 21 from corruption and plus 2 from gem levels from items, and that is granting 59% fire resistance just from that base gem, and that's being scaled up massively by aura effect. So in this build, I have approximately 160% increased aura effect for fire skills, or perhaps a little bit more than that, and 150 of that comes from these rings here. These have the modifier increases and reductions to fire damage, also apply to effects of auras from fire skills at 15% of their value, up to a maximum of 150%. Usually you need 1000% fire damage to actually obtain that maximum, but by using 2 of these rings, you can get away with getting just 500. It doesn't increase that maximum, but it does mean you can get to that 150% with half of the amount of fire damage investment. So I need 500% increased fire damage to be able to get all of that aura effect, and that means that Purity of Fire here on a level 23 gem is providing about 153% fire resistance and 13% maximum fire resistance. So that is absolutely absurd from a single gem. Really, really powerful interaction there. And that's kind of how I came to, building this setup here, is that, I need both of these rings to be able to stack up the fire damage and get that aura effect. which means I need a third ring slot, and that is why I'm making use of the Bloodline here from Ritual, which disables my utility flasks and makes me unaffected by poison as a kind of bonus there. But the important part there is that I get +1 ring slot, and that means that I can use all 3 of these rings at one time. So that's kind of where this started. Now, when it comes to getting the fire damage to actually activate this aura effect from both of these rings here, I'm actually making use of a node on the Chieftain which isn't used very much at all. It's called Ngamahu Flames Advance, and this says non-unique jewels cause increases and reductions to other damage types in a large radius to be transformed to apply to fire damage, and it also makes all of the nodes in the radius grant +4 strength, which is actually quite nice. So you can see over here, all of these nodes where I'm actually, placing a jewel in here, all of these circles that you can see, they are all rare jewels, and they're actually providing their radius to grant strength and also change those damage types. So most notably is this one here and this one up here. Right here, we have nodes like this one that leads into a 50% increased damage branch, and that's usually going to be for elemental damage, but this is going to be fire damage because of this node. And there's also, 24% over here. So all of these nodes are fire damage instead. And that means that they are directly applying to these rings, because these rings specifically need increased fire damage. Generic increased damage or increased elemental damage doesn't work. It has to be fire damage. And that also means that up here we're able to make use of this jewel. And then we can, grab all of this wheel here, which is usually lightning damage, but is instead granting fire damage. And down here, it means we can also move through here and grab these nodes. Again, all of those increases to cold damage are actually fire damage instead. However, the secondary bonus of this node is that it grants us a bunch of strength. And you can actually see on this build, I have 634 strength without any kind of strength scaling at all. I don't actually have, any kind of crazy strength scaling on my gear. I think the most strength that I have coming from gear is from this amulet here, which does provide 60, but I don't really think I have any other strength modifiers. There's a little bit here coming from these rings, but almost all of it is coming from the passive tree from these nodes. You can actually see just how much this is providing me. For example, if I was to remove this right here, this is 634. If I take this out, this is a lot of strength being added there, so that is really quite strong. And all of that strength scaling, of course, does scale up our life quite a bit, which is nice because we're not able to get, that much life scaling in this build. Once again, we're using the Veil of the Night. This has no life modifiers. Cloak of Flame, we are able to use the Mastery there, but, this doesn't have any flat life. There's a lot of places here where we're not gaining any flat life, like these rings here, no flat life. There's a little bit of increased life coming in from this, but again, no flat life. So I think all of that scaling coming from strength is quite important. We're able to reach about 5.5k life on this build. And with all that strength scaling, we're also able to click Iron Will here, which I think converts into about 14% more damage. So this is a really good keystone pickup here, and that's really quite nice. Now, once I kind of had this idea here to, make use of this with the Replica Veil of the Night there, I then have a new problem to solve. With defenses being 0, I now have to solve my defenses without using any kind of armor or evasion or energy shield. And the big thing there is getting a bunch of physical damage shift so that I, can deal with incoming physical damage in a way that doesn't involve making use of armor. So how I'm doing that is I'm getting about 84% of physical damage taken as fire in this build, and 70% of that works for damage over time as well. So 40% of that comes from the body armor here, another 20% from the Dawnbreaker shield, and then on the passive tree we actually have a jewel right here, the Bound by Destiny, which says if you have 4 Warlord items equipped, you have 10% of physical damage taken as fire. Once again, that is not specific to hit, so all 3 of those sources provide 70% combined for physical damage taken as fire. Also works for damage over time, which means we can quite easily solve, bleeding and corrupted blood and things like that, because we really don't take that much damage when 70% of it is being mitigated by 90% fire resistance. And then the remaining 14% there comes from a Foulborn Xop's Heart, which is 14% of physical damage from hits taken as fire damage for a total 84%. Now that means that with capped chaos resistance as well, we are pretty tanky against all incoming damage types, and we do have a little bit of avoidance as well. But before that, I want to actually discuss Arctic Armor and how this build kind of functions in terms of the playstyle, because Arctic Armor is a massive defensive boost in this build. This one grants a buff that makes you take less physical and fire damage hits while you're stationary, and that means that we can actually take a lot less damage because we are always stationary. We're basically using Incinerate with a setup that means we are casting Body Swap while we're channeling to move around. And how that works is that you are always considered to be stationary for anything which says while you are stationary. But anything that says that you gain a buff after a duration of being stationary, those things don't apply. So for example, if we look at this Pantheon here, the Soul of Tukohama, this is 3% additional physical damage reduction per second you've been stationary, up to a maximum of 9%. That wouldn't apply because every time you body swap you actually move your position, and you are considered to have moved, but you are never considered to be moving. You are always considered to be stationary because you're just blinking around with body swap, and you're still casting Incinerate. So the second line there, which is the upgrade for this Pantheon, the regenerate 2% of life per second while stationary, that will always apply. So that's why we're making use of this Pantheon here. And that also means that we can make use of another modifier here on the Bound by Destiny Jewel, which is consecrated ground around you while stationary if you have 2 Crusader items equipped. Now, getting all of these influenced items into the build was a little bit of a struggle. I do have a double influenced Cloak of Flame here, which is, Crusader and Warlord influenced, and then my belt is also Crusader and Warlord influenced. So that's the 2 Crusader influenced items equipped, and then in terms of Warlord, we have Warlord boots here and a Warlord weapon. Some of this gear actually does need to be recrafted. The weapon, belt, and boots are all things that I'd like to recraft at some point. But the reason why I didn't want to use my gloves is because the implicits that come from the gloves here are just so incredibly powerful. Both Unnerve and Fire Exposure is quite a big damage boost. So that is why I wanted to keep these open in terms of the influences, so I could use the Exarch and Eater mods. Now, Enmity's Embrace allows you to have a huge amount of fire penetration, but one of the things that the Will of Xoph rings there provide is that they boost up the aura effects of fire skills, and that means that you don't just get the benefit of using Purity of Fire. So let's discuss the damage scaling in this build. I'm using Incinerate Venting, of course, but the way that I'm scaling damage is primarily through resistance shredding, from both penetration and lowering monster resistance, and flat added damage from Anger. So Anger here is level 23, and this is providing 134 to 191 additional fire damage with spells, and this actually has about 200% aura effect, give or take. That's 150% coming from these rings here, about 10 or 15% coming from the tree, and then we have this modifier here on the weapon, which is another 33% aura effect for Anger. And that means that this gem is actually providing around 500 flat fire damage for Incinerate, which is really nice. And then we are able to shred a massive amount of resistance. That comes from, firstly, of course, the penetration from Enmity's Embrace, but we also have the use of Blasphemy support there with Flammability, which turns Flammability into an aura, which means that it's affected by the modifier there from Will of Xoph for 150% increased aura effect. And that is normally minus 39%, and then of course you have the 25% less multiplier coming in from Eldritch Blasphemy, but you have 150% increased aura effect, and that works out to be about minus 73% to fire resistance. And then when we're just kind of normally mapping, we have exposure coming from our gloves, so any kind of trash mobs that we hit, we're able to immediately apply a minus 12% fire exposure. But whenever we actually come up against a much tankier target, like a boss or a strong rare or something like that, that doesn't immediately die, we can drop our Pyroclast Mine of Sabotage, which, in this build, I just about have enough mana to use. I just want to discuss that for a moment, because this doesn't actually scale the exposure based on gem levels, so right now we have a level 4 gem here, and this is a cost of 4 mana. Then it's linked to Arrogance, which has a cost and reservation multiplier of 203%. Right now it's going to get to around 201, I think, at level 20. And the way I'm doing this is that it still costs mana to actually throw it, because Arrogance only applies the reservation as life, not the cost. And then, of course, Life Tap only applies the cost and not the reservation. So I just have enough mana here to actually use this. You can see this is 8 mana to throw it. So I can throw these down, and they're going to reserve a little bit of life. but that's fine. When I actually drop one of these on the boss, this has a base of 25% fire exposure, but that is also multiplied by our aura effect. And this one ends up being approximately another minus 70% to fire resistance. So with Flammability Aura and the Pyroclast Mine of Sabotage combined there, we have a little bit over minus 140% fire resistance. We also have Combustion over here, which lowers it by another 10% fire resistance whenever we actually ignite with that skill. And that means that when we're coming up against a boss, a normal boss which has 50% elemental resistance, we're able to lower them to minus 100% fire resistance, and then we have 200% or more than 200%, I should say, penetration. We have 200% from this ring, we have another 6% up here on the passive tree, and we also have this absolutely ridiculous Watcher's Eye here, which, I mean, I didn't farm this myself. I'm playing in hardcore trade. I actually managed to snag this jewel for 10 divines, which I think is a ridiculous bargain. It's a triple anger jewel, and I'm able to use all 3 of these modifiers. And this one has another 14% penetration there. So with those combined, I'm able to easily penetrate beyond minus 300% resistance. Remember, in Path of Exile 1, the cap on minus resistance is minus 200%, but penetration can go beyond that. But that is what I have going on in this setup here in terms of damage scaling. Now, I did just touch on the combustion here. Let's actually talk about the Pact of Lycia setup. So this is a brand new skill that came in this patch. It's kind of a way to boost up the damage of endgame spellcasting. And this one is for channeling skills specifically. It says, empowers the next 3 channeling spells you cast. Empowered skills deal 40% more damage. The way that works is that as long as you are continuously channeling the skill like this after you actually use the pact, this entire channel of the skill will be 40% more damage until you stop. And then, you know, if you have an empower again, you can go again. But that means that with the setup of, you know, body swap and cast while channeling, I can actually hold the skill and hold that 40% more damage for a very long time. And only need to kind of move around here with shield charge here and there to actually be able to move between packs if I need to. But most of the time, I don't really need this extra damage. The build already does tons of damage in maps and things like that, so this is not a big deal. But this is really nice on bosses. And the reason for that is that I have this kind of extra setup going on here. This build makes use of Elemental Overload, but there's a big problem with this node right here, and that is that Incinerate Venting has a base crit of 5%. However, Pact of Lycia has an extra skill attached to it. It has Heaven's Scourge attached to it, and whenever you're actually using the channeling skill, this will continuously hit nearby targets with lightning bolts, and that actually has a 7.5% base crit, so quite a bit higher there than the Incinerate. And I have this extra setup here, so firstly, this has Combustion, this is dealing fire damage because of anger, so it's able to ignite. But I also have Power Charge on crit, and this means I'm able to build up power charges whilst I actually move through the map and hit targets with this extra lightning damage here. And that means that those power charges can then translate into a much higher crit chance for Incinerate to be able to proc Elemental Overload. So this is kind of a setup here to be able to generate power charges to actually ignite and apply Combustion as well. And then I also have setups here to generate other charges. For example, over here I have a channeling cluster, and this one is 25% chance to gain an endurance charge each second while channeling, so that allows me to build up endurance charges, which are really strong defensively. And then in terms of frenzies, I am using Blood Rage, and even on bosses, because I don't have any use of utility flasks because of that ritual ascendancy there, I actually make use of the Writhing Jar, and that means that even on bosses, I'm able to actually keep up frenzy charges alongside Doedre's Elixir. Now, one thing I want to mention with this build is the Reservation, because that was a real kind of puzzle to actually solve, because both of these rings impose a pretty heavy Reservation efficiency of skills debuff on you, 21% coming in from each ring here, so 21% reduced Reservation efficiency of skills, that's a total 42% from these two rings. And I really want to use quite a few reservations in this build. I already discussed Arctic Armor and how powerful that one is, because, you know, I'm always considered to be stationary. However, there's other things that I really have to use in this build. One is Anger for the damage scaling. One, of course, is Purity of Fire. Then we also have to be reserving Flammability. And I also really wanted to fit in Tempest Shield, because I think having a little bit of avoidance in terms of incoming spell hits is really, really important. So this is something else I just managed to squeeze in. So I'll show you exactly how I'm doing that. We do have Charisma anointed there on our amulet for 16% increased mana reservation efficiency of skills. And we also do have this wheel here for a bunch here. And over here we have the Mana Mastery for 12%. And then we're making use of 2 small clusters right here. This one has 3 nodes in total and 1 notable for that huge amount of Purity of Fire Mana Reservation efficiency. And then down here we're making use of a smaller one here with Volatile Presence for Anger Mana Reservation efficiency. And lastly, we just have a single jewel here for 3%, and that means we are just about able to reserve all of those skills and still have just enough mana left to make use of Pyroclast Mine of Sabotage, and all of our other skills here are all life tapped. So Incinerate Venting is life tapped, and of course Righteous Fire doesn't cost anything. We've got Flame Dash, we have Shield Charge. All of this stuff is making use of life tap so that we don't actually have to spend mana on anything else. Now, unfortunately, even though we're in hardcore, we can't really make use of a guard skill on this build because there just isn't any gem slots for it. But to be honest with you, a guard skill doesn't really feel like it would be that useful anyway, because generally speaking, we don't have great access to, armor, for example, for Molten Shell. We do have endurance charges, but the endurance charge generation from that one node that I talked about isn't actually that good. It's only 25% chance per second, so you're just kind of able to keep up your endurance charges, but you wouldn't be able to sustain Immortal Call, for example, if it was going off very often. So really, I would only be able to use Steel Skin, I think, in this build, and I don't think that would be that big of an improvement, just generally speaking. So that is a bit of a shame that I can't use a guard skill here, but it is what it is. I just don't have enough gem slots. But on the Pantheon side of things, having both Arctic Armor and Tempest Shield does mean it frees up some of our options here. We don't need to use, Soul of the Brine King to be able to become freeze immune. We also have chill immune on our boots. And of course, we are shock immune, which means we don't need to use the Soul of Garakan either. So right now, I'm making use of Soul of Lunaris. I haven't really decided whether it's this one or Solaris. Both of these are actually quite good. The 6% reduced elemental damage taken if you have been hit recently here is really, really good, because whilst we do have quite a bit of block in this build, even when you block, it counts as being hit, so that 6% reduced elemental damage taken is going to be up very, very often. And the 10% avoidance there is also quite nice, but I will note that the movement speed and additional physical damage reduction isn't particularly useful. Meanwhile, for the Soul of Solaris there, the less damage taken from area hits is quite good, and the no extra damage from critical strikes if you have taken a crit recently, that's also quite good, but the other modifiers aren't that great. So right now I'm just making use of Soul of Lunaris. And for the miner, I'm using Soul of Tukahama, as I mentioned earlier, for the regen. But another good option you can consider here is Soul of Rizlatha, because this grants you flask charges if you haven't actually used a life flask recently, and that actually applies to the Writhing Jar. Even though this is a hybrid flask, this counts as a life flask. It gains life flask charges from this node, and this just means that if you're in, sort of a bossing setting where you're not gaining charges regularly, it does mean that you can actually gain charges and use the Writhing Jar to be able to maintain frenzies from Blood Rage, so that's quite nice. Now, at the end of this video, I just wanted to go over a few extra bits that I realised I didn't kind of talk about in the video. One, of course, is that we are Chieftain, so we're gaining Valako, Storm's Embrace. We're also using Tassadio there. This means that, any modifiers to our fire resistance are actually being applied to Cold and Lightning as well at 50% of their value, so we can basically focus all in on fire and chaos resistance. We also have Valako, so our modifiers to maximum fire resistance are being applied to Cold and Lightning. That means that we're able to hit 90 max res on all elemental resistances. And there's a few other things to mention here. For example, I'm making use of Arcane Adept, which is a cluster jewel notable there, which allows us to gain Arcane Surge, which would be a buff that I can't really get otherwise. And Arcane Surge grants 20% increased cast speed, which is actually a lot of damage for this build. This one also applies another 5% cast speed while channeling, so that's really quite nice. And I think once I actually reach level 98 here, which I'm almost getting to now, I plan to make use of the Rune Graft, which actually applies a buff to you, which says something like Arcane Surge also grants a percentage increase to life regeneration rate, which will mean I'm able to gain a bit more recovery there whenever I actually have that buff, which is pretty much all the time. Another thing I'll mention there is my Abyss Jewel right here, which isn't really anything too notable, but this one does have 20% reduced effect of curses on you while on consecrated ground, and since we are always stationary, we do always have consecrated ground up, which already reduces curses by 50%, so that means this build, just as a baseline, is 70% reduced effect of curses on us, which is really quite strong. I'll also mention there that alongside the less damage taken from Arctic Armor for fire and physical damage, I also am using Infused Channeling, which is 15% less damage taken from hits while channeling, which again is pretty much all the time. And I'll also mention there that even though this build makes use of the body swap cast while channeling interaction to kind of move around in terms of general gameplay, there is the setup there where you could basically drop both of these supports and make use of other supports there, you know, actual damage supports, in terms of like an arena bossing setting where you actually don't need that mobility, and that way you can actually skyrocket the damage quite a bit. I think just generally speaking, I was around 10 million damage or maybe 15 million damage or something like that, and with these extra 2 supports, it actually goes up to around, you know, 25 or 30 million damage. So pretty decent setup considering the defenses are not too bad. And that is pretty much it. I just wanted to go through, you know, a bunch of stuff that I'm doing with this build, a bunch of different interactions and things like that. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.